And I'm going to turn it over to you, Beth. Welcome. The floor
Thank
is
you.
yours.
Okay. Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm sure you've each had a very long day, and this is the end of your day. But I hope that you're going to find this, a new perspective and a bit challenging. But sometimes we need that in our life to help us look at a situation from a perspective that maybe we haven't seen before. And so we're going to look at health inequities tonight. And is it an emergency? It is. We've been grappling with health equity for a long time. This is not something that just started 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And what's important here is to understand, how did we get to this point? And why isn't it changing? And what do we need to do as educators and administrators and healthcare providers in order to make a difference? So the first thing that we have to look at here is history. Looking at 300-400 years ago up until today. Where does that inequity, where does it start? And let's look. So, whoops, there we go. Hopefully that should do it. My screen is now, there we go. That's how you do it. So, historically speaking, we look at the emergence of racism and discrimination and inequity. Now, what you're seeing here is actually a picture of the East Coast. I wanted a picture of Plymouth Rock as like the place where folks started to come. And you could consider them our first refugees who came here seeking freedom and seeking a place where they could practice their religion and live in peace. But if you've ever been to Plymouth Rock, you know that it's this tiny little rock and this fence around it. And I expected this huge, monumental, significant thing, and it was this small. Well, if it's 400 or 500 years old, it's been covered with dirt, but the message is still clear. People came here seeking a better life, but unfortunately, what came with was some issues that revolved around equality and equity. So the first thing I'd like you to do is I'd like you to reflect on this. Just take a pause moment as we look at this. Here's the question. This is about your story now. When did you or your ancestors first come to America? Or were they already here? Why did you or they come? Did you or they experience prejudice, discrimination, or racism? Did you or they experience prejudice or discrimination in accessing healthcare? That's the question. That's the question that we pose to ourselves. We all have a story. We all have a history. And those narratives have transferred from many generations until who we are today. We carry that story with us. My example is my grandfather from Ireland and him sharing his story of discrimination as a child, because his language, while it was English speaking, his friends couldn't understand, and so they mimicked and made fun of him. So the point is, we all have a story. So when we interact with people, it's important for us to recognize they bring their story with them. So I'm going to share a little bit of story, a little bit of history here. Provident Hospital. I'm not sure how many of you have heard of that. Provident Hospital was actually established in 1891. It is the first Black-owned and Black-operated hospital in the country. And how did it come to be? It was Emma Reynolds. Emma Reynolds was a young woman who wanted to be a nurse, but she was denied entry into every nursing school that was in Pennsylvania. And so she and her pastor and a colleague started Provident Hospital. They're Black operated and owned hospitals across the country. I'd like to share a story with you about this. When I was living in Milwaukee, this was like the mid-70s or so. My husband lost consciousness at a football game. I wasn't there, but his cousin said, oh, they took him to Misericordia Hospital. I'd never heard of Misericordia Hospital. I said, well, where is that? And he said, well, you gave me directions. I went down there and he was in critical condition at a hospital that had no services. It was an ER, but they had no doctor on call. It was 6 blocks from Mount Sinai Medical Center, in which had state-of-the-art kind of equipment. The message was, if you were Black and you were living in Milwaukee, you were going to be taken to Misericordia. Now, the interesting part was I worked at Mount Sinai Hospital. And the interesting story about that, and here at Mount Sinai, I was talking with some of the physicians there, and most of them Jewish. And they said, I said, well, Mount Sinai is in New York and across in other states. I said, why did it start? It started because Jewish medical students couldn't get residencies at white hospitals. So they started their own. And then we look at Tung Hua Dispensary. Now, Tung Hua Dispensary started in San Francisco in the late 1890s. And it started because, and in response to the fact that Chinese citizens could not access healthcare facilities in their area. The interesting part was they actually staffed it not only with Western physicians, but also with Chinese traditionalist healers. They took the culture and said, make it a part of who we are. And after the great earthquake of 1906, it then was destroyed. They came together as a community and built the Chinese hospital, which still stands today in San Francisco and still serves the Chinese community. And then, of course, we have the Indian Health Services, which was established in the 1880s. It was run by the Department of War, but it came at a time when forced assimilation was going on, Indian schools were going on, and because of that, they could not continue with their traditional healthcare and their practices. All of that was outlawed. We still have the Indian healthcare services now, chronically underfunded and underserved. So when I talk about history, it says that we need to know, where did this racism and discrimination start? Is it still part of our narrative? And it is. And it has become an issue of trust. So we look at, and I'm sure you've heard of it, when I was teaching today in global health, and I was sharing some of this information, and I got the nods from the students like, oh yeah, we heard about smallpox blankets. Basically, and it was that you infested the blankets with smallpox and you took them to the Indian nations. And there was an example in 1763 where this Captain User wrote to his superior saying that these Shawnee and the Mingwe tribes were now laying siege to Fort Pitt, and what should they do? And so the head person there of the general said, this was his quote, "Could it not be contrived to send the smallpox among the disaffected tribes of Indians? We must, on this occasion, use every stratagem in our power to reduce them." And as we know, thousands of indigenous people died from smallpox. Now, what about the Tuskegee syphilis study? This is another example of mistrust, because no, we're asking you to be a participant in a study, but we're not really going to tell you what it's about. So in 1932, they started the Tuskegee syphilis study. And the reason they started it in the South was because the South had a huge outbreak of syphilis, and there was syphilis in the military. And so they wanted to be able to follow people, see what their symptoms were. So they were brought in, over about 400 African-American sharecroppers. They were brought in. There was no consent, of course. They were told they would be treated for quote unquote bad blood. And they were really just followed. They were given other benefits like we will pay for your funeral kind of thing. Here's the deal. In 1943, penicillin came on, and penicillin was a cure for syphilis, but they never told the participants in the study that there was a cure. And it wasn't until 1972 when it got published that this was going on, and there was just general outrage. Again, this is not too long ago. So we wonder why people don't trust the health system or don't want to use our services. And another story, I was at a transcultural nursing conference, and there were two women behind me, two Black women, they were professors, and they were having a conversation. The woman who was going to talk, there were two women who were going to talk, and they were both Native American women who had been to Indian school, and they were telling their story, but they hadn't started yet. So the conversation's going on behind me, and I'm kind of listening, and they were talking about some of the Black students being kind of depressed, but not wanting to go to the health services to seek treatment. And I was thinking to myself, well, that's because there's such a stigma on being depressed that you don't really want people to know. Now, I didn't say this, I was just thinking it. And the one woman said to the other one, well, I know why they're not going. And she goes, I do too. And the woman says, yeah, the Tuskegee study. So there's trust. There's mistrust. And then we look at the Jewish chronic disease. This was actually in the early 1900s, and they injected patients with cancerous cells, but they never told them. And then, of course, forced sterilization. We heard about this at the early part of the 1900s. And what happened there was that women who were thought to be how do they put it, that they were unfit to procreate. And so that sterilization actually went on from the early 1900s up until the 70s. And they were targeted of the minority groups, and especially the Hispanics at that early time. The interesting part was, and the whole thing was about eugenics. We want to make the perfect society here. And in 1927, the US Supreme Court voted to uphold states' rights to sterilize people. Now, from 1955 to 1970, there was a huge sterilization program through Indian Health Services, and more than 70,000 Native American women were sterilized without consent, and as young as 11 years old. So that becomes significant. The Henrietta Lacks, and I'm sure you've heard of this, it's called she was a young African-American woman. She was 31 years old. She went to Johns Hopkins because she was having vaginal bleeding. Now, Johns Hopkins Hospital was one of the ones that Black people could go to and get treatment. So she went there, and they took a biopsy, and what the pathologist recognized was really within a very short period of time, those cells replicated over and over, and that never happened before. When he would get cells before, they would die out in the first 24 hours. So because of this, they continued to use her cells in research to study the effects of toxins, to study the effects of hormones or drugs. Her family was never notified until 1975. So when we think of trust, we think of prejudice, we think of discrimination, we have to recognize that it has impact on our health and on our well-being. And I'd just like to open it up just to maybe a 5-minute discussion here. Is there anybody who has experienced that racism or discrimination while trying to access care, or has heard these stories from our parents and our grandparents? If you'd like to share, we'd like to hear your story. And I can understand it's a very sensitive subject, but I think it's good for us to recognize our story, our narrative may be very different than our colleagues, very different than our patients, very different than our students. And I think the important thing is, and this is what I teach in transcultural nursing, is it's important for you to recognize your story, your values and your beliefs, and to know that you may find their similarities but differences with the people that you encounter. So as a result,
I see Vicky,
yes, go
Vicky
ahead.
has a hand.
Oh.
Oh, please.
Yes.
Go
Yeah.
ahead, Vicky.
Well, I don't necessarily have a personal family story about it, but as you were talking about forced sterilization, I was remembering that it's just happened in the last 3-4 years, where they took immigrants who were trying to get in across the border into the country, and were sterilizing them without their permission.
Thank you for sharing that. I heard some of that, and it's good that we bring it to the forefront, because we think sometimes we're past it. And if we're not, we need to be that
No.
voice.
While you were
Mhm.
talking about it, I just Googled, sterilization of immigrants, and it came up with state of Georgia, state of Texas, several states
Okay.
did it.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you, Vicky. I appreciate that. And Sylvia?
So lest you think this is far away, I just read an article, I think two days ago, that indicated that Sonoma County, and a particular place in Sonoma County, was one of the major centers of the eugenics movement and forced sterilization. So that's just a few miles from us. So it was not far away in Georgia or somewhere, in the long ago past.
Right. And so what you're saying, Sylvia, too, is like, we need to raise the awareness, and we need to get that word out. When those things are happening, we need to make sure that it gets publicity, because people don't know what they don't know. And that's why. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that. Vicky, you had something else? Okay, so let me go on with, as a result. Now think about this. We have this story, this history, mistrust, not being able to access healthcare. I mean, when I was talking about the incident in Milwaukee and the Black hospitals, up until the 1960s, in many parts of the country, Black people could not access white hospitals. So it's, as Sylvia said and Vicky said, it's not that far behind. It still happened, and it happened within the lifetime of people in my family. So let's look at coronary artery disease, hypertension. Thing is, if you're Black, you have the highest rate of hypertension in this country. You get it at a younger age, and you are more likely to die of it than if you're white. For coronary artery disease, we look at the stats. If you're white, it's 16 per 100,000. If you're Black, it's 64 per 100,000. Why the disparity? Is it access? Is it economics? Is it education? It could be a lot of things. Diabetes. If you're Black, Hispanic, or Native American, you are 2 to 3 times more likely to have diabetes than someone who is white. And if you're Native American, you have 20 times the rate of end-stage renal disease, and you are 2 to 3 times more likely to have an amputation. Why the discrepancy? Now, when we look at infant and maternal mortality, I think this is the one that grabs me every time I teach it. And when you look at infant mortality, it's per 1,000. Okay. So if we're looking at infant mortality in the United States, it's around 6.8 per 1,000 births. If you're American Indian, it's now 9. If you are Black, it is now 14. Why the disparity? If maternal mortality generally is around 12, yeah, no, let me see. Let me get that right. Maternal mortality, no, sorry about that. It is more like 11 per 100,000. But if you're American Indian, it's 17. Hispanic, it's lower, it's 9. Asian, it's 11. If you are Black, it was up to 36 per 100,000. It's now at 41. Why is it getting worse? Where are we missing with this? And if we look at HIV and AIDS, we know that it is the leading cause of death of Black men between the ages of 25 and 54. It is the 3rd leading cause of death for African American women. And if you are a child who has HIV AIDS, 80% of those children are Hispanic or Black. The discrepancies. And we bring in the 2004 Sullivan report. Now, the interesting thing is sometimes these reports, you think, well, that was 2004. No, this is still very true today. If you look at the research today and you look at the studies today, it gets replicated over and over. What did it say? It said that the most vulnerable of our population are less likely than whites to be given appropriate cardiac medicines, undergo cardiac bypass surgery, to receive renal dialysis or transplant, to avail themselves of the best diagnostic tests, and to receive treatment for stroke or cancer, HIV, AIDS. That research is still going on today. And my good friend who is an educator, she got her PhD at Harvard. She worked for Boston University. She worked for Stanford. And she had diabetes that didn't get taken care of. She is now on renal dialysis. They have not yet offered her transplant status. Why is that? You know, so when we look at history and we look at today, we have to recognize there is impact if we don't address it. Now, I want to show you this video. It's called Unnatural Causes. Is Inequality Making Us Sick? It's a trailer. It was actually came out in 2008. So when you listen to the stats, they are from that time frame. But the message is still very clear that inequality in education and salaries and opportunities make a difference. So let me play that for you.
There's one view of us as biological creatures that we are determined by our genes, that what we see in our biology is somehow innately us because of who we were born to be. What that misses is that we grow up and develop. We grow up as children, we grow up as adults and continue. We interact constantly with the world in which we are engaged. That's the way in which our biology actually happens. We carry our history in our bodies. How could we not?
Living in America should be a ticket to good health. We have the highest gross national product in the world.
I'm very happy to finally have some of my cars in one location, some of them.
We spend $2 trillion per year on medical care. That's nearly half of all the health dollars spent in the world. But we've seen our statistics. We live shorter, often sicker lives than in any other industrialized country. We rank 30th in life expectancy.
Especially of economically developed countries, we are at the bottom of the list.
A higher percentage of our babies die in their first year of life than in Malta, Slovenia, Cyprus. How can this be? Is this just because 47 million of us have no health insurance?
Healthcare can deal with the diseases and illnesses, but a lack of healthcare is not the cause of illness and disease. It is like saying, since aspirin cures a fever, that the lack of aspirin must be the cause of the fever.
Or is it mostly because of our American diet and personal health behaviors?
Those behaviors themselves, in part, determined by economic status. And so our ability to avoid smoking and eat a healthy diet depends, in turn, on our access to income, education, and what we call the social determinants of health.
But wouldn't our genes trump social determinants of health?
Among twins who lived together until age 18, who basically grew up in the same households, so had at least a relatively similar exposure. If they diverged later in life, if one became professional and the other was working class, they ended up with different health status as adults. This is among identical twins.
Written into our bodies is a lifetime of experience, shaped by social conditions and policies that can determine who will be sicker, who will die sooner.
There are ways in which our society is organized that are bad for our health. And there's no doubt that we could reconfigure ourselves in ways that would benefit our health.
There are huge inequalities in the society. All this wealth is maldistributed.
Pet food, ice for the pets' water.
And I think that's in part why the US as a whole has relatively poor health amongst the rich countries, and why even the better off people are suffering. And we think that that is not inevitable.
Oops. Oh, goodness.
The right protein.
I don't know how I did that one. I got too excited. Let me go back to all right. See if I can. There we go. I'm not sure what that is for, but so what they look at here is what he was saying is the access to income, the access to education. And so the WHO in 2012, World Health Organization, established the social determinants of health. And what they say is that the social determinants of health are circumstances in which we grow up, you know, where we live, the systems that are in place for us to deal with issues. But then it goes on to say, these circumstances are really part of a set of forces, economic policies and politics, but look at the money and the power and the resources available. So social determinants of health say that education, access to education. We know there's that difference going on where if you're Asian or white, you have a graduation rate of about 80 something, 85, 88%. But if you're Black, it's more like 80. If you're Hispanic, it's 76. And if you're Native American, it's 71. Living wages, we're asking people to live on $7.25 an hour. We can't do that. So we have to look at all of these housing inequities. We don't have housing. And we grapple with that here in the Valley, people trying to find housing and seeking employment and healthcare. Okay. And then I'm trying, I need to get onto this slide, but I can't see my other side here. But what we're looking at here is justice issues, racism issues, right? Does it give me a sense of hopelessness? Why should I even try if there's nothing there to support me? So when you look at the social determinants of health, when we list them out as the social determinants of equity, right? It means that we as a community need to monitor these. We need to see what opportunities, where are the disparities, where are we missing the mark on all of these? And then to put in place policies or practices that take that and bring equity to it. But it's got to be intervention on our part. We have to be that voice that steps out to do that. And so the next level up is awareness. I love this picture. It was actually taken in Brussels or in Belgium, because we were at the autonomum, I don't even know how to say it. But the point is, you have to go up all these stairs. So if you get to awareness and you want to get to the top, how are you going to get there? You're going to have to climb those steps. And that's why there's leveling off in between each one, because we can't do it in one fell swoop. This is a learning experience that takes us all time. We are not aware just because we want to be. We're aware because a situation presents itself and we go, I didn't realize that. All right. And so each opportunity asks us to look at ourselves critically and to say, I didn't realize that I had that bias. I didn't realize that remark was taken that way. So we need to step back and look and say, indeed, let's look at this. Let's be okay with looking at it. Let's be okay with having a discussion. Now, the Institute of Medicine report, again, this is a seminal report that came out in 2003, still extremely valid today. And basically what they say is that, you know, stereotyping is automatically activated without consciousness. Now, one of the things we hear now is implicit bias, right? And implicit bias is unconscious. We don't even know that we have that bias, right? So one of the activities that I have both my classes do is they go to that Harvard implicit bias testing, and it's a very fast-paced kind of thing, and it helps you to see, am I a little biased? Do I have a little implicit bias I didn't even know I had? And I usually get the aha moment from students who go, either A, I thought I had it, you're right. B, oh, I didn't realize I had it. Or C, you know, if I could have just taken more time on that test, I would have gotten it better. Well, the point is, when we're in a real life situation, our subconscious kicks in. And those things, those biases, those stereotypes help us control the situation, right? So the point is, we all have it. Everybody has implicit bias, but it's held by people who believe they don't judge others. And I certainly hear that a lot, like, well, I don't judge anybody. I treat everybody the same. And I'm saying, well, you shouldn't, because we're all different. We can't. Or people say, I don't see color. Well, if you don't see color, you don't see me. And if I don't see color, I don't see you. Okay, so we need to recognize our conversation here. So it helps us, or affects how, I shouldn't say helps us, it affects how we process and recall information. But here's the key, and this is the part that's the take-home message that says it guides our expectations and perceptions. So we see something, we take it in, and it guides how we're going to react to it. It shapes those personal reactions. So what I encourage you to do is to pause, do mindfulness, Do a pause and reflect. Turn off the automatic pilot. What they ask you to do is, I always put my hand to my heart just because that helps me to center myself. But it's like, let me center myself for a minute. Let me think about this. And now let me re-enter the conversation. That's what it's asking us to do. So when we deal with inequities, whether they are healthcare or in the educational setting, or how we treat students or how we treat our colleagues, the point is we need to recognize the inequities in our own life and then to be the advocate for those who are the most vulnerable of our population. And so this is the model that I use in my book. It's for nursing, but you can put anybody there. You could put student at the top and educator at the bottom. You could put administrator and staff up here. But the point is, these are our cultural values and beliefs. It says who I am, what's important to me, respecting my elders, family comes first, getting a good education, having financial security. The point is, my cultural beliefs are not yours. And so where do we find common ground? And we look at education, and I share with my students, I say, education, yes, how far did you go to school? But you know what I want to know? How do you learn best? Do you learn best by doing a video? Do you learn best by reading something? Do you learn best by being in a group? So if I'm dealing with my patients, and I want to provide education, I need to ask that question. It's important I know their literacy, right? But I need to know, how do you learn best? How do you communicate? Now with my patients, what I do when they come in and they sit down, and especially if I'm seeing them for the first time, I observe and I try to reflect their style of communication, because I can come off as kind of aggressive. It's not my fault. I have 9 brothers and sisters, so we were all loud and we're all, animated. But what if I'm dealing with someone who uses minimal eye contact, who talks softly, okay? Family and kinship, egalitarian, patriarchal, matriarchal. It makes a difference. If I come from a very egalitarian family, but I'm dealing with a patient whose father is patriarchal, and she says, I have to ask my father first, then I need to respect that and say, yes, like this woman who said to me, my job is to get better. My dad's job is to take care of me and to be my voice. You always want to bring that in. Socioeconomics, how does that play into even anybody deciding to go to healthcare? We saw that play out with COVID, right? The disparities in ethnic groups, minority groups, because they are the first line essential workers and I can't miss work, but you have high rates of COVID. Religion and spirituality. And the question I ask is, how does your religion and spirituality help you in times of disability or death or illness? It's important. I tell my students, when you go in the room, is there a Quran there? Is there a Bible there? Is there a card of the Virgin de Guadalupe? Have that conversation and recognize we are coming with our Western beliefs. Their health beliefs and practices include traditional healers. So our job is to inquire, what have you already tried and has it helped? So here's our patient or our family or our student at the top. Here we are down here. Where do we find common ground? That's the most important thing. It's when you find common ground that you can make a difference, that we can make a difference with health inequities and with other inequities when we see them. We need to be that voice. So what can we do? We can acknowledge history. We can acknowledge history and the effect on healthcare outcomes. We can recognize our own story, those of our ancestors, those of our colleagues. We can address issues of systemic racism, not only in the classroom, but in curriculum. We have to take a closer look at what are we teaching and how are we teaching it, and looking at cultural ways of learning. All students don't learn the same way. We need to embrace our classrooms with creativity. And then really taking a discerning look at our policies and our practices and saying, What are our hiring practices? Who gets on that board to interview them? Who are the participants that need to be a voice at the table? So it's asking us to step back and to change the way we do and look at things. And then I think it's important to offer those cultural awareness and sensitivity seminars, because we all teach differently. We can learn from our students, we can learn from each other, but we need cultural awareness as educators, as healthcare providers, as administrators, as faculty, because if we don't know our own culture, how do we reach out and find common ground with those that we serve? So that's our challenge. That's our challenge. And I have a poem I want to conclude with, and we have time to open it up for a little bit of questions or comments, but let me read my poem for you, if I may. It's not mine, but you and I come from different places. Our journeys will lead us to new destinations. Our ways of living in the world are shaped by generations of those who came before. Our thoughts reflect the images painted in our minds by our ancestors. Our dreams unite the heritage of our past with the hope for our future. Our spirits echo the diversity of our origins. And for a moment, just for a moment, our paths converge. It's an opportunity to learn, to care, to heal each other and the world. Thank you. So I would be open to comments or discussions or challenges.
Well, I say thank you initially for bringing this challenge to us. And it speaks to what we here at PUC, the DEI leadership and team are addressing. And I'm just curious to know what others might be thinking or feeling at this point.
Sylvia?
So I think I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay. I'm so excited to have finally heard in a nutshell what you present. I'm sure throughout many classes and through your books as well. I hope you feel accompanied at a distance through what we do at World Languages in our Spanish for Healthcare, because we talk about a lot of the similar things in the small part of our class, and I really appreciated hearing your take on it and a broader perspective and what you do. I'm assuming in the global, especially in the global health area. I really particularly loved your image of the staircase and the landing places, the places where you have a pause, where you can reassess, where you have opportunities to kind of regroup and understand what you've learned. We do show a video that was made in the Bay Area that really talks about the whole idea of lifelong learning, that all of this is a process. And there really is no, there is no finish line. There's continual reassessment and getting better at it. And I think it's a very helpful thing to consider. We're all learning, we're all getting better at this. And it's okay if you make mistakes. You just need to, recognize them and move forward and become more informed and help others, reach that as well. The idea of cultural humility versus cultural competence, that there's not certification in it. You just become more aware.
Thank you, Sylvia. I appreciate your comments. Thank you so much.
Tanya, I see Tanya's hand. Go ahead, Tanya.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, for those of us who don't work in healthcare, there's a lot a lot in your presentation that really resonated with me, in part for, you know, my background is intercultural relations, and I used to teach intercultural communication, and so it's something that really resonated with me. But I also kind of want to think for those who maybe be on this call, or who maybe don't work in healthcare, or maybe don't work in issues of DEI or something, or, you know, I was thinking about what would I do if I was not in the position I was at, and I'm kind of attending this kind of a workshop or this kind of discussion. And I was like, you know, as a person who, because of my skin, how privileged I am, and realizing that, you know, when it comes to even the birth experience, so I recently gave birth to a young boy, that even that birth experience is quite different. You know, I complained about having you know, I was like, my medication's not working, I'm feeling pain, and I was listened to, and I was my birth experience was fantastic. Actually, it's still painful, let me say that, but it was a fantastic experience. And then when I was talking to some other people later, who were talking about, you know, some people of color who have been experiencing, you know, what their birth process was, and how it was a different experience. And then when I learned, or having learned that, you know, there was a belief that Black people didn't experience pain quite the same way, or they didn't have as much pain, and so they wouldn't be getting as much pain medication, and women experiencing birth wasn't getting as much pain medication. So all of that is just kind of was going in my mind as you were talking, and so what is our role when maybe this isn't our main job, and really is it just to provide that speaking point and speak out for others, and when within our privilege?
I think
like that's not okay.
Yeah, I think you nailed it right there. It's like recognizing, like you say, your privilege, but at the same time, those opportunities to be a voice for someone else. It may be that it's healthcare, but maybe it's education, maybe it's the police department, maybe it's businesses, and you can take any piece of this and apply it to that. And it's an awareness. It's like, let's have a conversation. Let's start the dialogue. Yeah. So I see there's another hand there.
Hi, I'm Guadalupe. I'm a nursing student. I just want to say thank you so much for the lecture. I really enjoyed it. I just wanted to sort of speak on moving forward beyond my personal practice in the healthcare setting. What can I do on a systemic level, and other than you know, advocating for others or recognizing my own biases?
Well, I think maybe I'm thinking out loud as in my mind here, but just by you being present and saying what you're saying, now it's time to pass that on to your faculty. Okay, that's the next step, to say, I'd really like to have this and this and this incorporated in our class. I notice we don't talk about, and to bring to their awareness that you see that there's something missing. Because if we're going to go out and practice as nurses, or we're going to go on and become nurse practitioners, or whatever we're going to do, the reality is 2 points, Guadalupe. One, we talked about cultural humility, but two, cultural awareness education is an ongoing process. It's a journey that never ends. So every opportunity is an opportunity for you to be a voice. And I think for myself, sometimes I don't speak up when I think I should speak up. And it's uncomfortable, but take each opportunity as it comes your way. And don't be afraid to say, you know, I really felt uncomfortable when you made that comment, you know, so it's okay to be the voice. And thank you for joining us, but thank you for being in the program and being our future. Thank you so much.
I think that does answer a lot of questions for me, and I really appreciate it. Moving forward, I understand that I am technically one of the minority in my group. However, I am white passing, and I do have a ton of privilege, and I do speak English very well. What do I do to advocate for diversity and inclusion in my workplace? I noticed that in my preceptorship, the majority of my colleagues were, Caucasian American nurses, and it didn't necessarily match up to the patient.
Right.
How do I say, the patient population, and in that way, some of the needs were not met for the patients.
Right. Right.
So what could I do, for instance, if I got a job there and I was the only Spanish speaking nurse, or the only, on that
And
shift?
it's more than, it's more than language. We know that. It's language and it's culture. So let's just say you get a job at Hospital X, and first you have to be there for a bit to get a real sense of, are they, aren't they? And then you start talking with your director of your department, and or you go to the education department. You say to them, I noticed this, this, and this. Have you considered bringing in someone to do some cultural diversity training so that it will help us to care for our patients? And you can say, well, I interpret for others and I'm good at it. What I see missing is the whole cultural views and beliefs and practices of this person are not being addressed. And I think a good way of doing that is to hire Beth Lincoln. I'm just kidding. I think a good way to deal with that is to bring in someone who can provide that opportunity, because what you'll see is outcomes will be different. If they have their cultural needs met and their language needs met, they will have their healthcare needs met. And that can be the impetus. That can be what you say to them. If you have their cultural needs met and their language needs met, it will have a positive health outcome. And isn't that what we're all looking for in this hospital?
I do want to say too, that I love the questions that you just asked, Guadalupe. And the other piece you have to think about is when you call in something or call out something, you have good intentions, but some may retaliate because those questions may have created some discomfort and it may not be received well.
Right.
So you have to be willing to walk that road. Sometimes it's a very lonely road. I've walked it many times when you've said, hey, I see that this is missing and it will be good if you do such and such, like you just said, Beth, but sometimes there's a price to pay for that and it's a fight. And you end up experiencing all kinds of micro and macro aggressions, unfortunately. Right. So, and I want you to be aware of that because it's a real thing in these environments. And I saw Dr. David Williams in the video, and he actually talks about how racism is a public health crisis. It can make you sick. It's making people sick. But I also wanted to touch on, Beth, what you mentioned regarding classroom curricula in my other hat that I wear over inclusive teaching and learning, and looking forward to beginning an online community here, PUC, through DEI. And I love what you said, where we need to look at, what we're teaching, how we're teaching. And one of the questions I ask is, do you see yourself in the curriculum? Do you hear yourself
good point.
Through the experts who are sharing knowledge? So I love that. I see that in here, that you're challenging people to think about how we do that piece, as well as looking at policies and practices. So great conversation tonight. I'm thankful that this has actually kicked off what we're really looking for. So.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for coming and just for the opportunity for myself. I love having the opportunity to be able to be a voice, and I want to thank you from my heart. Thank you.
Well, Tawan, I know you're in the room. You're our other, oh, maybe he's left the room. Well, Tanya, I'm going to turn it over to you as we wrap it up, and just wonder if you want to say a few words.
Thank you again, Beth, for doing this. This was a fantastic presentation, and everyone, I look forward to your participation in future diversity discussions on this campus.
Yes, we absolutely do, and we hope that you will join us for those. And I guess we're just gonna, once again, Beth, thank you. This isn't over. I think there's a part B, and definitely a part B to this. And we hope that, as Tanya said, that you will make space for DEI. We have an amazing council, some great thinkers and doers, and there are several initiatives that we are rolling out. One is our diversity discussions, and we are holding another one next month. Each month we'll be doing something to bring individuals together. And I know Tanya will be rolling out an excellent initiative called Let's Talk, bringing people together just like this, but on the campus of PUC. And we mentioned the online learning community for educators, which will be virtual, as well as some training that should be rolled out soon, our understanding is. Correct, Tanya?
Yes.
Yes, so students, faculty, staff, everyone will have access to those trainings, and Tawan has worked diligently on those, and Marie has worked diligently with our web designer to ensure that DEI has a presence on the campus. And Sylvia, did you want to say just a tad bit about what you're working on for us?
Sure. Are you referring to the Indigenous Peoples kind of initiative?
Yes.
So together with Tanya and a few other interested parties, we have a subcommittee of the DEI, and we're going to be reaching out to the local Susquehanna Intertribal Council and working on a land acknowledgement for starters, and to see what needs are in the community that we can address, and what relationship we can get going with the Native peoples of this place, who were here long before anybody else was, and certainly deserve more than a place at the table. We need to learn from this particular group that we've not, those of us who are not Indigenous have not learned from. So I'm looking forward to learning from them and hopefully establishing a positive relationship as an institution with this group.
Yeah, we're really excited and also thankful for the work that you're doing, Sylvia, for diversity, equity, and inclusion here at PUC. So if there's anyone in here who is open to volunteering and supporting DEI efforts, please reach out to Tanya on the campus, or Tawan, or Sylvia, or myself, or Marie, and we will be happy to have a conversation and explore how we can fit you in to DEI initiatives. Once again, Beth, thank you for the challenge and for the information presented. And we often talk about the importance of a story and history, which can be painful for some. Vicky, I see your hand. I'm so sorry. Go ahead. Let me let you have a moment. Yes.
I just wanted to run something by Beth, but not necessarily take up other people's time. But something analogous is that for years, most of the research that was done on heart disease was done on men.
Mm-hmm.
And when they finally started including women as part of it, they discovered that women have different symptoms, you know, different experience and all of that. And when you were talking about the statistical correlations, you know, with longevity and infant mortality and all of that, my field is nutrition. And one of the things that I talk about in class when I talk about vitamin D was a study that was done of 400 women. Half of them were African American, half were Caucasian. All of them were getting the same amount of vitamin D in their vitamin supplements. But Black women, 83% were deficient. In Black infants, 92% were deficient in vitamin D. For white women, 47%, and their infants, 66%, significantly less were deficient. The reason that seems pretty obvious to me is that if you have melanin in your skin, it's like sunscreen. It just takes longer in the sun to make the same amount of vitamin D. And, you know, low vitamin D women have higher bacterial vaginosis. Their infants that are born to low vitamin D women have higher amounts of asthma and wheezing. And so, you know, if you have something that may be a natural cause, all of us live more of our life indoors now than our ancestors did. And actually, if you're older, it takes 4 times as long in the sun to make the same amount of vitamin D as when you're younger. So there's all these variables. But I just wonder if there would be better results for the birth of Black infants if somebody was paying more attention to some of those nutritional factors.
And I'll be very quick, and I would agree with you 100%. I think you have to look at specifics, and you have to look at metabolizing and getting vitamin D in, and how can you do that? You know, that is one aspect, and you just bring up a really good point there, Vicki. It's so important. If you're looking at diet, you've got to look at the cultural influences. What are people eating? Also, what do we need to watch out for? I would also like to encourage you to watch on that Unnatural Causes, Inequality Making Us Sick. They have 7 different videos after that, but it's called When the Bow Breaks, and it follows African American women in pregnancy. And one of the things that they find is that irregardless of income and education, they are much more likely to have preterm births than any other group. And part of that comes because in our bodies, when we deal with stress, it's the cortisol that's released from our adrenal glands. And when the cortisol is released, it increases our blood pressure, it increases our blood sugar, it decreases our immune system. Now, that's fine if it's fight or flight and I'm running from the dinosaur. But when I have to face it on a daily basis, that's the difference.
Right.
So it's like, you're right, Vicki. If we're looking at pregnant women and we're looking at different groups of pregnant, we have to diversify our thinking. We cannot put everybody in the same box. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
So don't get me started. I'm just saying I can go on for
I hear you. I hear you. Very, very.
I gotta let the people go to bed. They had a long day.
These are great questions. And you know, as I said, Beth, I think there's gonna have to be a part 2. Just for a conversation, just to keep this conversation going about what does that mean? How does bias show up? Does bias play a part in, you know, you asked a question about experiences. I was quiet. I remember going to the ER in pain. I was supposed to fly out to present at a conference. And one of my colleagues who was flying with me was like, "Where are you? What are you doing?" And I was like, "I can't move. I'm in pain." She took me to the ER. By the time the doctor got in, he barely looked at me. He just had a sheet in his hand. He said, "Well, you can just take something over the counter. Why are you even here?" And I said, "Well, I'm in a lot of pain and I just cannot move like I would usually be able to move." And he said, "Well, I think you're just gonna have to go home. Take some over the counter pain meds, blah, 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 blah." And my colleague said, "Well, doc, I guess we need to go home and figure out how we're gonna do this." And he said, "Are you a doctor?" And my colleague said, "Yep, that's why I called her doc." And he didn't ask what kind of doctor. He said, well, okay, we need to do a cocktail of this,
Oh,
this, or this. I got a cocktail. I got a shot in my butt. I just got a whole bunch of things, all because she used the word doc.
I know.
And in that moment, I thought, well, what if somebody isn't a doc? Would they be sent home to die? And it was quite telling for me personally to have that type of experience. I will never forget it. But we can go on and on and on and on and on.
Good.
But,
we could.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
I'm just going to press stop recording for a second.